Okay. My name's Roy Suddaby. I am the Winspear Chair of Management at the University of Victoria, and I was one of the co-editors of this special issue, which was really motivated by an interest in introducing qualitative methods to entrepreneurship research. It's pretty clear that the history of entrepreneurship research up until recently has really been dominated by quantitative methods, and quantitative methods have their place in answering certain types of questions. In fact, they're really good at answering the who and the when questions, but they're not so good at answering the how and why questions. And by that, I mean answering the sort of intersubjective things that happen inside the heads of individuals. Like what motivates an entrepreneur to do what they did, or what were their thought processes as they make a series of decisions. Those sorts of questions are not well answered by correlational studies, but really are answered by a variety of methods, including archival methods, as well as interview methods that try and drive down into this notion of motivation and intersubjectivity. So that was really the key element of addressing this special issue, was trying to highlight to researchers out there that there are other methods apart from survey analysis and that sort of thing to get at real key questions about entrepreneurship. Is that, is that Yeah, I don't think I should do that because I will upset someone just by omission or not treating them evenly. So I'd be a little reluctant to do that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So as a result of this, we got a range of papers, and I was first of all impressed with the amount of submissions. I think we had close to 100 submissions in the initial application, which we, through a process of reviewing and peer review, we got down to the 9 papers that made the final special issue. But within that context, within those 9 papers alone, we have a range of methods that run the gamut from archival methods, interviews, autoethnography, ethnographic studies, and grounded theory approaches, which is really impressive because it runs the gamut of methods that are available in qualitative methods, and it provides a nice horizon for individuals who traditionally have done quantitative methods but might be interested in pursuing one of these approaches. And I have to say the quality of the work that these papers represent is just outstanding. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we did when we saw this great range of studies out there is we thought, wouldn't it be cool as co-editors to apply our own qualitative techniques to analyze in a sort of a grounded theory content analysis each one of the studies that we've done and try and code them in broader themes to see what sort of meta findings we could draw out of those 9 studies about entrepreneurship. And to contextualize this a little bit, one of the core puzzles that we as co-editors were interested in is this essential question of where do entrepreneurial opportunities come from? And if you're familiar with the literature, you see that there's these two answers floating around out there. One is that there is a hard objective world, and entrepreneurs go out like Vasco da Gama and discover the entrepreneurial opportunity. The other end of the spectrum is to take a much more socially constructivist view and to say that actually there is a co-production or co-creation or co-construction of entrepreneurial opportunities that occur with the entrepreneur, him or herself, being very actively involved in that. So that's the sort of framework that we had when we coded these papers. And what we found, first of all, is that the papers fell relatively evenly, 4 on one side, 5 on the other, on this continuum, in that sort of divide. But when we coded some of the research themes in each of those, the key finding that we came out of was that there were two meta themes that were embedded either in the foreground or background in each one of the papers. One was this question of imprinting. And the imprinting question really falls on the side of discovery, that there is an objective hard world out there. And the part of the answer there is that the entrepreneurial opportunities occur or the discoveries occur as a result of predisposing factors that are either in the individual or a part of the individual's experience. And this has kind of a path dependence or a personality difference that suggests that the entrepreneurs were successful or unsuccessful because of attributes that were relatively unchangeable. The second theme that came out of this was a notion of reflexivity. And it suggested that rather than seeing the world as given or taken for granted, that some of the entrepreneurs were successful because they had this ability to see the world not as it was, but as it might be, and then engage in activities, work or promotion or legitimation activities that brought their vision to fruition. And when you map these two somewhat orthogonal elements on an axis with each other, then you can populate kind of a continuum of all of the papers that exist along there. So we think that those themes are quite resonant and can have some value to answering this broad theoretical question of where do entrepreneurial opportunities come from. And the answer is probably elements of both, but it actually has some profound implications for practice, partly for entrepreneurs themselves, but largely for us as educators. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Part of the problem in creating a kind of a notion of path dependence in education is if we teach the management world as a given. I'll give you an example from chemistry because it might be a little bit more accessible that way. And that is to say there's two ways to teach chemistry. One is to teach it in the way of here is the periodic table of the elements, and that's the way the world is, and you should structure your knowledge around that framework. The other approach is to teach it somewhat more historically, and that is to say, first so-and-so discovered hydrogen, so-and-so discovered helium, and present the periodic table of elements in that sort of processual form. The first one mimics this notion of path dependence and this idea that the world is given to you and you have to adapt to it. The second one suggests that there's tremendous opportunity out there, that the world is discovered and constructed over time, and you too could contribute to that process. And I think by and large in management schools historically we've taught the world as a given. And the reality is, and I see this happening in some of the schools that teach entrepreneurship in a hands-on approach through incubator labs and that sort of thing, takes a very different approach and suggests that no, we can teach the world as a host of opportunities or as a process of discovery. And so I think that's the biggest implication that comes out of this, that we can actually change the frames by which we see the world. Yes. And that's an excellent question, and I don't want to privilege one or the other of those, but just to recognize that both of those worldviews exist, and that we can actually manipulate. We can educate entrepreneurship by an understanding of that, because I see a high degree of equifinality, multiple paths to success using both of those approaches. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So I grew up in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta, where there were these incredible fast streams that the both the British military and the American military used to train their people about whitewater rafting, that sort of thing. And they had two completely different approaches to educating. The American approach was very systematic, broke it down into manuals, taught them dry land training, and then by the time the individuals went into the water, they had this figured out, and they learned how to whitewater raft. The British approach was very experiential. It was, there are the boats, there are the paddles, you guys go figure it out. And the strange thing for me observing this is that they both actually were successful in doing that. And I think the same argument applies in this context, that we can understand the world as a given, hard, constructed place where some individuals have unique abilities to see opportunities and take advantage of them, or we can see the world as a socially constructed, malleable place where very, very reflexive actors can create opportunities for themselves. And I think that both of those opportunities, or both of those approaches, are available to different types of personalities, different types of entrepreneurs. But once we recognize that, then we understand that there is absolutely no silver bullet. There's no single universal way of teaching entrepreneurship, but rather you have to take a configurational approach that matches elements of the individual to the context in which they operate in. And you know, it's interesting that we've understood this about organizations for a long time. There is no single one best way to organize. And yet we fall back into that same sort of contingency theory trap when we start talking about entrepreneurship. And we should learn from our mistakes and say, no, there are actually multiple paths to success here. Yeah. But, yeah. Become more valuable. I agree with that. And the real thing that we can do then in that context is provide the students with a whole toolbox or a whole range of frameworks or templates that they can look from. The other element of that I would say though is that we should teach entrepreneurship from a historical point of view as well, because it is by looking at, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, it's by looking at mistakes that have been made over time as well as the successes that you understand that there's probably a lot more opportunity in the world than you realize. But we tend to have taught this scientific model of teaching to say this is the way the world is and you should structure your thinking around that. Well, the world has changed, but we only understand the degree of change and the degree of entrepreneurship by teaching it historically. And I would like to see courses in management schools on the history of entrepreneurship. Yeah, yeah, great. That's fantastic. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's right. And the nice part of what you've done is that the individual case studies are important, but it really is aggregating, trying to learn from those case studies. That's brilliant. I haven't seen a lot of research. You know, we could be doing this as academics as well, and we haven't done a lot of that. And by that I mean aggregating the historical case studies of entrepreneurship, or even, and here's another interesting point, is even looking at the changing rhetorical accounts that entrepreneurs give of their own success over time. Because, and this goes back to my experience as a lawyer, where, you know, you run across these guys that make a lot of money because early on they will admit that there are elements of luck to it, but there's also elements of agency and insight. But as they get older and they retell these stories, it becomes much more deliberate and agentic, and the luck gets filtered out. And that's not surprising. We all behave that way. You know, we're retrospective sense makers in what we do. We don't study that in the entrepreneurial story either, and I think we should. That's fantastic. If you want to collaborate on that, I would love to do that. I think that's brilliant. Mhm. Yeah. That's brilliant. I love that. Yeah. Well, I've talked already about the implications for education, so I'll leave that with the caveat that I think there should be more history in business schools generally. In terms of implications for practice, you won't get much of that out of our overview paper, but each of the individual papers has some pretty profound insights for practice. And I'm only going to mention a couple of the key insights that are top of mind for me, because they're in a sense so simple but actually so profound. So one of them, and this probably isn't going to be a surprise to many, is the way in which individual entrepreneurs deal with failure. And you know, as you're probably aware, we don't look at failure very much in management schools, failure of organizations or of entrepreneurs. But there is one paper that really drives home this notion of reflexivity, that demonstrates that the case study is exclusively of entrepreneurial failures, but there are two groups of failures there: the ones who lose their entrepreneurial motivation completely, and those that go on to bigger and better things. And the distinction is that the ones who go on to bigger and better things are highly reflexive about what caused them to fail. They go through a mourning and a grieving process, but they actually make sense of it, and they dust themselves off and go off and do it again. And that, again, probably a very simple finding, but absolutely profound, and one that we don't see in the literature as much as I think we should have. The second one, and that operates at a very micro level. The second one that I'll mention, very interesting paper about the king crab industry. And it really talks at a much more macro level about the degree of, and this is my words, not the words of the author, the high degree of institutional work that the entrepreneur who has this really, really good idea has to go through to legitimate the good idea in the broader social and institutional environment. And that includes everything from convincing other people to do the same thing as you are, even though that is going to cause an increase in your own competitive position. As well as lobbying the government, lobbying trade regulators, that high degree of institutional work, which isn't really part of the glamorous life of the entrepreneur, as we like to present it, is critically important for success, and we don't talk about that enough. And those are just two of the key insights. There are similar ones that I think are very exciting on all of in all of the papers. Yeah. It is, yeah, and you need this critical mass, and that sometimes means inviting other people to share in your success, even though it's going to make you slightly less economically profitable than you thought you might be. Yeah, that's good. This has been a great conversation. We'll have, unfortunately, I have a student waiting at the door here. If